The cold was a living thing. It crawled through the coarse weave of the burlap sack, traced icy fingers down Vaelin's spine, and settled like stones in her lungs. Each breath came shorter than the last, little white puffs that she couldn't see but could feel condensing against the rough fabric pressed to her face. The darkness inside the sack was absolute, broken only by pinpricks of moonlight that did nothing to warm her or ease the terror clawing at her throat. She had stopped screaming hours ago. Or perhaps it had only been minutes. Time had lost all meaning when your world shrunk to the confines of hemp and fear. Her cousins had made sure the knots were tight, their laughter still echoing in her memory as they tossed her from the wagon like refuse. The sound of their horses had faded into the howling wind until she was left with nothing but the creak of frozen branches and her own racing heartbeat. This is how I die, she thought, and the clarity of it was almost peaceful. Alone in the Blackwood, murdered by my own blood for a seal and a signature. The irony would have made her laugh if she'd had the breath for it. All those years of embroidery lessons and learning to pour tea with perfect grace, and this was her end, discarded like kitchen scraps in the forest, where even the wolves were too wise to hunt in winter. Her fingers had gone numb an hour ago. She'd tried to work at the knots binding the sack, but her hands were useless lumps of flesh now, unresponsive to her desperate commands. The frost was seeping through her fine velvet gown, the one her aunt had insisted she wear for the journey to meet her betrothed. What a cruel joke that had been. There had never been a betrothed. Only Cousin Gareth's cold eyes and Cousin Mariette's false smile as they'd bound her wrists and stuffed a rag in her mouth. At least it will be quick, Vaelin told herself. The cold was already making her drowsy, that dangerous heaviness that the old servants used to warn about. Sleep in the snow and you'll never wake. Perhaps that would be better than whatever they'd planned if she'd resisted. Then she heard it. The sound was so faint at first that she thought she'd imagined it. The rhythmic thud of hoofbeats, muffled by snow but unmistakable. Multiple horses, moving with military precision rather than the panicked flight of prey or the casual swagger of bandits. Hope flared in her chest like a candle in a storm, fragile and desperate. She tried to scream, but her voice came out as barely a wheeze. The rag in her mouth was frozen now, locked against her tongue, and her throat felt scraped raw from her earlier attempts. The hoofbeats were getting closer, but they were also moving at an angle that might take them past her completely. In another minute, they would be gone, and with them, her last chance at survival. No, no, please, not like this. Vaeline threw her body sideways, ignoring the sharp stab of pain as her shoulder connected with something hard beneath the snow. A rock, maybe, or a frozen root. She rolled again, feeling the sack shift and drag across the ground. The sound was pathetically quiet, just the whisper of fabric on snow, but it was something. It was movement. It was a prayer made physical. The hoofbeats slowed. She froze, straining to hear past the thunder of her own pulse. Had they noticed? Had they seen the disturbance in the snowdrift? Or were they simply pausing to check their direction before continuing on to wherever dukes and their patrols went on winter nights? Sir. The voice was young, male, and hesitant. There's something off the path. Probably a dead deer. This voice was older, carrying the weight of command, and a bone-deep exhaustion that Vaeline recognized even through her haze of cold and fear. Leave it. No, please look. Please. It moved, sir. A pause that stretched for an eternity. Then, show me. The hoofbeats came closer, and Vaeline used the last of her strength to shift again, to prove she was alive, that she was worth the trouble of investigation. Her vision was starting to dim at the edges, black spots dancing in the darkness of the sack, but she refused to surrender to unconsciousness. Not now, not when salvation might be mere feet away. She heard a horse stop beside her, heard the creak of leather as someone dismounted, heard boots crunch through the snow, each step measured and cautious, the approach of a man who expected traps and treachery at every turn. Then the footsteps stopped. Vaeline felt more than heard the presence looming above her, something large and solid and radiating a heat that her frozen body desperately craved. Through the weave of the sack, she could make out the vague shape of a man, broad-shouldered and tall, backlit by the moon. This was her moment, her only chance. She gathered every scrap of will she possessed, fighting past the frozen rag and the numbness in her jaw, and forced out two words, They came as barely more than a whisper, a thread of sound that the wind should have stolen, but in the sudden stillness of the forest, they rang clear as a bell. "Help me, my beautiful family. Before we continue with this story, please like, share, subscribe, and tell me in the comments section where you are watching from." The figure went rigid. For a heartbeat, Vaylin thought she'd failed, that her voice had been too quiet, or that this stranger would prove as cruel as her cousins. Then strong hands were pulling at the rope, binding the sack, and a voice like gravel and midnight spoke directly above her. "Get the healer, now." The first thing Vaylin saw when the sack was ripped open was a pair of eyes like winter itself, pale grey, sharp as sword points, and utterly unreadable. They belonged to a face carved from granite and shadow, all hard angles and weathered planes, framed by dark hair shot through with silver at the temples. A scar ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, pale against sun-bronzed skin, and his mouth was set in a line that suggested smiling was a foreign concept. Duke Tharion Bellgrave, the Iron Duke of Ironholt. Even half-frozen and delirious, Vaylin recognized him from the descriptions she'd heard, whispered in her aunt's parlor. A man who killed his first enemy at 12, who held the northern passes against the Cravathi hordes with nothing but will and steel, who buried his betrothed and never spoke her name again. And now he was staring at her like she was a puzzle he hadn't decided whether to solve or discard. "She's alive," one of his men said, surprise evident in his voice. "Barely." Tharion's voice was rough, unused to gentleness, but his hands were careful as they pulled the frozen rag from her mouth. "Who did this to you?" Vaylin tried to answer, but her jaw wouldn't cooperate. The cold had seized her muscles, turned her tongue to lead. All she could manage was a pathetic whimper that made her want to weep with frustration. She was Vaylina Morroway, daughter of Lord Cassian Morroway, educated in 3 languages and the complete works of the poet-philosophers, and she'd been reduced to helpless mewling in the snow. Something must have shown in her eyes, rage or shame or both, because the Duke's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not quite softening, but acquiring a glint of what might have been respect. "Don't try to talk," he began, working at the ropes binding her wrists, his fingers deft despite their size. "Conserve your strength." Behind him, a younger man appeared with a fur-lined cloak. The healer, Vaylin assumed, though he looked barely older than her own 20 years. He dropped to his knees in the snow, already pulling supplies from a leather satchel. "Hypothermia," he said tersely, pressing 2 fingers to her throat to check her pulse. "Her heartbeat's weak. We need to get her warm, but carefully, too fast, and we could stop her heart entirely." "How long does she have?" Tharion had freed her wrists and was now examining her hands, his frown deepening at the blue tinge to her fingertips. "If we move now, maybe she makes it, maybe she doesn't." The healer wrapped the cloak around her shoulders. "If we wait, she's dead within the hour." Tharion didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, he scooped Vaylin from the snow, cradling her against his chest as though she weighed nothing. The sudden warmth of his body was almost painful against her frozen skin, but she found herself pressing closer anyway, animal instinct overriding pride. "We ride for Ironholt," he commanded, already striding toward his horse. "Double time." "Sir, she might not survive the journey. She definitely won't survive staying here." Tharion settled into his saddle with Vaylin still in his arms, positioning her so she was sheltered from the wind. "And I didn't dig her out of the snow just to watch her die." The ride was a blur of pain and disconnected sensations, the thunder of hooves, the iron-bound strength of Tharion's arms holding her steady, the bite of wind that found every gap in the cloak. Vaylin drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind playing tricks in the darkness. Sometimes she was back in the sack, suffocating. Sometimes she was in her father's study, watching him sign the papers that would make her brother his heir instead of her. Sometimes she was looking up at her cousin Gareth's face as he smiled and said, "Nothing personal, Vay, just business." Once, she surfaced enough to realize she was shivering violently, her teeth chattering so hard she thought they might crack. "Good," Tharion said above her, and she realized with dim surprise that she must have made some sound. "Shivering means your body's still fighting. Keep fighting." She wanted to tell him she'd been fighting her whole life, fighting to be seen, to be valued, to be more than a pawn in her family's political games, but the darkness pulled her under again before she could form the words. When she woke next, It was to the sensation of being carried up stone steps. Torchlight flickered orange against ancient walls, and voices echoed in what sounded like a vast hall. She caught fragments of conversation, found in the Blackwood, nearly frozen. The Duke himself brought her. "Clear the West Tower guest chamber," Tharion was saying, his voice cutting through the babble like a blade. "Hot water, blankets, and get Mistress Carag. Now." "My lord, do you think it wise to— do I pay you to think, Seward, or to follow orders?" The voice that had questioned him fell silent. Vaylin felt herself being carried through a doorway, then laid on something soft, a bed, her addled mind supplied, with actual mattresses and linens that smelled of lavender and winter air. Heaven compared to the burlap prison she'd escaped. She forced her eyes open, needing to see where she was, needing to understand if she'd truly been saved or simply traded one danger for another. The room swam into focus slowly. Stone walls hung with tapestries, a fireplace already being stoked to roaring life, narrow windows that showed nothing but night and snow beyond. And beside the bed, the Duke himself, still in his travel-stained cloak, watching her with those winter-sharp eyes. "You're safe now," he said, and it wasn't a comfort or a promise. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who bent the world to his will through sheer force of conviction. "No one touches what's under my protection. Remember that." Vaylin tried to speak, to thank him or warn him, or explain the danger he'd invited by saving her, but her body finally gave up its fight against exhaustion. As darkness claimed her again, she thought she saw something flicker across the Duke's scarred face, something almost like the ghost of the man he might have been before the world taught him to be iron. Then sleep took her, and for the first time in days, she didn't dream of cold or betrayal. She dreamed of steel. Vaylin woke to warmth and the smell of bread baking somewhere far below. For a moment, one blessed, perfect moment, she thought she was home, in her childhood bedroom at Morroway Keep, before her father's death, before the inheritance dispute, before everything had turned to ash and betrayal. Then she opened her eyes and saw the unfamiliar stone ceiling arching high above her, and memory crashed down like an avalanche. The sack, the cold, the Duke's pale eyes watching her as if calculating whether she was worth the trouble he'd taken. She sat up too quickly, and her head swam with the motion. Her body ached in places she hadn't known could ache, a deep bone weariness that spoke of how close she'd come to the edge. Someone had dressed her in a clean linen nightgown, soft against skin that still felt tender and oversensitive. Her hair had been brushed and braided. The room was warm, almost too warm, with a fire crackling cheerfully in the massive hearth. "Easy there." A woman's voice, crisp and no nonsense, came from near the fire. "You've been asleep for nearly 2 days. Your body needs time to remember how to work properly." Vaylin turned to find a middle-aged woman in a healer's grey robes, settling into a chair beside the bed. She had kind eyes set in a stern face, the combination somehow reassuring. The sort of woman who would set a broken bone without flinching but bring you honeyed tea afterward. "Mistress Carag," the woman introduced herself. "The Duke asked me to tend you. How do you feel?" How did she feel? Vaylin took inventory, fingers and toes all present and responding to commands. No stabbing pains, no numbness. Alive, against all odds. "Like I've been trampled by horses," she managed, her voice hoarse from disuse. "But alive. That's about right." Carag poured water from a pitcher into a clay cup. "You're lucky the Duke found you when he did. Another hour and we'd be having a very different conversation. Or no conversation at all." Vaylin accepted the cup with trembling hands and drank deeply. The water was cool and clean, better than wine. "Where am I?" "Ironholt, the West Tower, specifically reserved for the Duke's honored guests." Something in Carag's tone suggested this was unusual. "He's given orders that you're to have whatever you need for your recovery." Honored guests. Vaylin almost laughed at the absurdity. She was a discarded inconvenience, a problem her family had tried to solve with rope and winter. What could the Iron Duke possibly want with her? Then again, what choice did she have but to find out? "I need to see him," Vaylin said. "The Duke. I need to thank him properly, and I need to—" She paused, unsure how much to reveal. "I need to explain why I was in the Blackwood." Carag's expression suggested she already knew more than she was saying. The Duke doesn't require explanations. He saw someone in need and acted. That's his way. Nothing is that simple. With Duke Tharion? Actually, it often is. Carrick stood, smoothing her robes. But if you're determined to speak with him, I'll send word that you're awake. He left instructions to be informed immediately. After the healer departed, Vaylin forced herself out of bed on unsteady legs. The room was larger than she'd initially realized, furnished with understated elegance, a heavy oak wardrobe, a writing desk near the window, tapestries depicting mountain landscapes in threads of grey and blue and silver. Someone had left clothes folded on a chest at the foot of the bed, a simple wool dress in deep green, sturdy but well made, and a pair of soft leather boots that looked close to her size. She dressed slowly, her muscles protesting each movement, and made her way to the narrow window. What she saw stole what little breath she'd recovered. Ironholt was aptly named. The fortress perched on a cliff face like a bird of prey, all dark stone and sharp angles, built to withstand siege and storm. Below, the land fell away in dizzying slopes to a valley where she could make out the distant shapes of villages and farmland, snow-covered and peaceful. Behind the fortress rose the Ironspine Mountains, jagged peaks that scraped the belly of grey clouds. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, much like its master, she suspected. And it was a very long way from anywhere her cousins could easily reach. The thought should have comforted her. Instead, it made her stomach clench with a different kind of fear. She was alone in a fortress ruled by a man known as the Iron Duke, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was legend even in the southern courts. The stories said he'd executed his own seneschal for theft, that he'd held a mountain pass against impossible odds by piling enemy dead as a wall, that he'd loved once, and buried that love so deep he'd become something less than human. What did such a man want with a half-frozen girl pulled from the snow? The door opened without ceremony, and Vaylin spun from the window to find the Duke himself filling the doorway. He looked different in daylight, no less intimidating, but more solid somehow, more real. He'd traded his travel cloak for a simple black tunic and trousers, though he still wore a sword at his hip. The scar on his face was more prominent in the grey light, filtering through the windows. "You're awake." It wasn't a question. His eyes swept over her, assessing, and she had the uncomfortable feeling he was cataloguing every weakness, every vulnerability. "Good. We need to talk." Vaylin straightened her spine, calling on every lesson in deportment her tutors had drilled into her. If this was to be an interrogation, she wouldn't face it cowering. "I owe you my life, Your Grace. I don't have much left to offer, but what I have is yours." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "I don't want your life. I want answers." He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, arms crossed. "Starting with why a nobly born woman, and you are nobility, your accent gives you away, was tied in a sack and left to freeze in the Blackwood. Your family." The word was a knife between her ribs. Vaylin met his gaze steadily, refusing to flinch. "My cousins. They want what I inherited from my father, the Morroway seal and the lands it controls." She hesitated, then added the rest. "And they'll come looking for me once they realize I'm not dead." "Let them come." Tharion's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "They'll find Ironholt less accommodating than the Blackwood. You don't understand. They have influence, connections. They'll bring... I am the Duke of Ironholt and Warden of the Northern Marches. I've held these mountains against warlords and winter demons alike." His eyes were winter cold again, but there was steel beneath the ice. "Do you truly think I fear a handful of greedy relatives?" And looking at him, at the casual way he wore violence like other men wore cloaks, at the absolute certainty in every line of his body, Vaylin realized he didn't. He feared nothing, which made him either her salvation or the most dangerous man she'd ever met. Possibly both. The first week at Ironholt passed in a haze of recovery and careful observation. Vaylin had learned early in life that survival often meant understanding the spaces you occupied and the people who controlled them. So even as her body slowly remembered what warmth felt like, she watched, she listened. She mapped the rhythms of the fortress like a scholar charting stars, who held power, who carried grudges, where the fault lines in Tharion's iron rule might lie. What she found surprised her. The Duke was everywhere and nowhere. He appeared in the training yard at dawn, sparring with his men until they were exhausted and he'd barely broken a sweat. He presided over the morning audience in the Great Hall, dispensing justice with an efficiency that bordered on brutal. He rode out on patrols that sometimes lasted days, returning with frost in his hair and blood on his sword that no one dared ask about. But between those public displays of ducal authority, there were moments that didn't fit the legend of the Iron Duke. Vaylin first noticed it on her 4th day, when Mistress Carrag finally allowed her to leave her chambers for short walks. She'd been exploring the East Wing, trying to learn the layout in case she ever needed to flee quickly, when she heard voices echoing from an open doorway. Children's voices, bright with laughter. Curious, she'd approached quietly and peered around the doorframe. The room was a makeshift schoolroom, filled with a dozen children ranging from perhaps 6 to 12 years old. They sat on benches before a slate board, most dressed in the simple homespun of servants' children. A few bore the haunted look Vaylin had seen in the mirror after her father died. Orphans, she guessed, taken in by the fortress. And standing at the front of the room, pointing to letters chalked on the board, was Duke Tharion Bellgrave. "Sound it out," he was saying to a small girl with braids and a gap-toothed smile. His voice had lost its usual granite edge, softened to something almost patient. "You know this one, Mera. We practiced yesterday." The girl squinted at the board, then her face lit up. Bellgrave. Good. Was that pride in his voice? Vaylin stared as Tharion actually smiled, a small thing, barely a quirk of his scarred mouth, but genuine. Who else wants to try the next one? Hands shot up eagerly. The Duke, the man who reportedly showed no mercy on the battlefield, called on a boy with a bandaged arm and waited with infinite patience as the child struggled through the word Ironholt. Vaylin retreated before she was spotted, her mind churning with this new intelligence. The Iron Duke taught orphans to read. It didn't fit. It didn't fit at all. She began noticing other cracks after that. The way Tharion always served himself last at meals in the Great Hall, ensuring his people ate first. The fact that the servants met his eyes without fear, answered him without trembling. The afternoon she saw him in the stables, not inspecting his warhorse but carefully bandaging the leg of a stable boy's mongrel dog, while the child watched with tearful gratitude. "Hold him steady," Tharion had instructed, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he wrapped the splint. "He'll try to bite when I set the bone. Don't let go. Will he be all right, my lord? If you follow my instructions exactly. Clean water twice a day, change the bandage every morning, and keep him off this leg for a fortnight. Can you do that?" "Yes, my lord. I swear it." Tharion had finished the bandage and stood, ruffling the boy's hair with casual affection. "Good lad. Now get him somewhere warm, and next time you find an injured animal, come to me first instead of trying to help it yourself. Understood?" The boy had scurried off with his dog, and Tharion had turned to find Vaylin watching from the stable entrance. For a moment, something almost like embarrassment crossed his face, as though he'd been caught in an act of weakness rather than kindness. "You should be resting," he'd said gruffly, brushing hay from his sleeves. "I've been resting for days. Mistress Carrag says I need to walk." Vaylin stepped into the stable, emboldened by what she'd witnessed. "That was kind of you. With the dog. It was practical. Happy servants work harder." But his eyes wouldn't quite meet hers, and Vaylin realized with a jolt of understanding that he was uncomfortable with the observation, as though kindness was something to hide, a shameful secret to keep buried beneath the iron exterior. "Why?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Why what? Why do you work so hard to make everyone think you're made of stone when you're clearly not?" The question hung between them like a drawn blade. For a moment, Vaylin thought she'd overstepped, that the Duke would retreat behind his walls and she'd lose this glimpse of the man beneath. But instead, Tharion moved to his warhorse's stall and began checking the tack with methodical precision. "Because stone doesn't break," he said finally. "Stone doesn't bleed, and stone doesn't make the mistake of trusting the wrong person." He glanced at her, and there was something raw in his expression. "I learned that lesson the hard way. I won't learn it again." There was a story there. The betrothed he'd buried, the betrayal that had turned a man into a fortress. Vaylin wanted to ask, wanted to understand the wound that still festered beneath his armor, but the shutters had already come down over his eyes. "You're recovering well," he said, his tone returning to its usual businesslike clip. "Mistress Carragh says you'll have full strength back within a fortnight. Thanks to you. Thanks to your own stubbornness. Most people would have given up in that sack." He finished with the tack and faced her fully. "Which brings me to a question I've been meaning to ask. What do you plan to do when you're healed?" Vailin blinked. She'd been so focused on surviving, on understanding her rescuer, that she hadn't thought beyond the immediate present. What did she plan to do? She had no money, no allies, no proof of the crimes committed against her. Her cousins controlled Morroway Keep and probably thought her corpse was feeding wolves in the Blackwood. "I don't know," she admitted. "I need to get word to my brother. He's only 10, and they'll use him the same way they tried to use me. But beyond that," she spread her hands helplessly, "I have nothing. You have your mind. I've watched you these past days, the way you observe, calculate, think 3 moves ahead." Tharion crossed his arms, studying her with those analytical eyes. "That's worth more than gold, if you know how to use it. What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that you stop thinking of yourself as helpless." He moved toward the stable entrance, then paused. "You survived, being abandoned, to die. You kept your wits when most would have surrendered to panic. Those aren't the qualities of a victim, Lady Vailin. Those are the qualities of a survivor." He left her standing in the stable, his words echoing in the sudden silence. Through the open door, she could hear the sounds of Ironholt going about its daily business, steel ringing in the forge, guards calling orders, somewhere a woman singing as she worked. And for the first time since her cousins had bound her in that terrible sack, Vailin felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite hope. She'd had hope beaten out of her too many times. But something harder, sharper. Determination. The Iron Duke was right. She'd survived. And survivors didn't hide forever. Tharion summoned her to his study on the 10th day. The room was exactly what Vailin had expected. Austere and functional, with maps covering every available wall space and a desk buried under correspondence that spoke of the endless administrative burden of holding the North. What she hadn't expected was the warmth. A fire roared in the hearth, and actual books lined the shelves between the maps, their spines worn with use. Philosophy, military history, agricultural treatises. The Duke, it seemed, was as much scholar as warrior. He stood at the window when she entered, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the mountains. He didn't turn immediately, and Vailin had the sense he was gathering his thoughts, choosing his words with the same care he might choose weapons before battle. "Close the door," he said finally. "What we discuss needs to stay between us." Vailin did as instructed, her pulse quickening. In her experience, conversations that began with such warnings rarely ended well. She moved to stand before his desk, back straight, chin up, her father's daughter, even stripped of everything but her name. Tharion turned to face her, and his expression was grimmer than usual. "I've received inquiries, 3 separate letters in the past 2 days, all asking variations of the same question. Have I seen or heard anything of Lady Vailin Morroway, missing daughter of the late Lord Cassian, presumed lost in the Blackwood?" Ice slithered down her spine. "From my cousins? One from your cousin Gareth, one from a magistrate in Thornhaven, likely paid for by your family, and one—" he paused, and something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "One from Lord Severin Wraith." Vailin's breath caught. Severin Wraith was no minor lord scrambling for scraps. He controlled the southern trade routes and had ambitions that reached all the way to the capital. What interest could he possibly have in her disappearance? "I don't understand. I've never even met Lord Wraith." Neither had I, until 6 months ago when he tried to buy passage through the Eastern Pass. Tharion moved to his desk and unrolled one of the maps, a detailed rendering of the northern mountains. His finger traced a line through the peaks. The Serpent's Run, ancient trade route, abandoned 50 years ago after a rock slide made it too dangerous. But it's the fastest way to move goods, or armies, from the eastern provinces to the coast. Vailin stepped closer, studying the map. Her father had taught her to read terrain before he'd taught her to read books. She saw immediately what Tharion was showing her. The pass cut through territory that belonged to Morroway lands, she whispered. "Your lands," Tharion corrected. "Or they should be. Your father held the deed and the seal. the only legal authority to grant passage through the Serpent's Run. His eyes found hers. Who holds that seal now? The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The sudden rush to have her father's will probated. Cousin Gareth's insistence that she sign documents she hadn't been allowed to read properly. The betrothal that had never existed. The journey that had ended in a burlap sack and snow. I do, Vaylin said, her voice hollow. Father changed his will 3 months before he died. Left the seal and the pass rights to me specifically, separate from the rest of the estate, he said. She swallowed hard against the memory. He said some inheritances were too important to leave to chance, and that I had the mind to guard them properly. Tharion was watching her with an intensity that made her feel pinned like a butterfly to a board. Did you sign anything after his death? Any transfers of authority? They tried. Gareth presented papers, said it was just a formality, that I needed to sign over temporary custody until I came of age. She'd been 17 then, grieving and lost, but I refused. Father had warned me never to sign anything without reading it 3 times and having independent counsel review it. Gareth was furious. And then? Then they became insistent, controlling. They dismissed my father's old advisors, isolated me from anyone who might have helped. And when I still wouldn't sign, when I started asking questions about where the seal actually was, Vaylin's hands clenched into fists. That's when Cousin Mariette suggested the betrothal, said I needed a husband to manage such weighty responsibilities, said she'd found the perfect match. But there was no betrothal. There was no anything except rope and darkness and cold. Silence fell between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Tharion moved to a locked cabinet and withdrew a leather folder. When he opened it, Vaylin saw official seals and signatures, contracts, by the look of them. Lord Wraith approached me 6 months ago with an offer, Tharion said, spreading the documents on his desk. He wanted to partner with me, to reopen the Serpent's Run, promised substantial profits, trade advantages, political alliance. All I needed to do was use my authority as warden to override the old Morroway deed and grant new passage rights. You refused. I don't override legal deeds, no matter how profitable the alternative. His mouth twisted into something too bitter to be a smile. I've built my reputation on being predictable, Lady Vaylin. Harsh, perhaps, but fair. Once you start bending the law for profit, you're no better than the vultures you're trying to keep at bay. Vaylin stared at the documents, her mind racing through implications. So Wraith went to my cousins instead, offered them something. Money, position, power, in exchange for getting me to sign over the seal. And when I refused, they eliminated the problem. Tharion gathered the documents and returned them to the cabinet with careful precision. A dead heiress creates a legal tangle, but it's one that can eventually be sorted, especially with a magistrate in their pocket and a powerful lord vouching for their character. The casual way he said it, dead heiress, sent a chill through her. That's what she was supposed to be. A problem solved, a loose end tied off. Her brother would have been next, she realized with crystalline certainty. Once the seal was secured, a 10-year-old boy who might ask inconvenient questions when he came of age would be just as disposable. Where is the seal now? Tharion asked. The physical object itself? Hidden. My father built a safe into the wall of his study, behind a portrait of my mother. Only family knows the location, and only I know the combination. She met his eyes. I memorized it the day after his funeral, then burned the paper he'd written it on. Gareth searched for weeks, tore apart half the keep looking for it. That's when I knew something was wrong. They'll tear apart the other half once they're certain you're dead. Let them. The combination is a date, my mother's birthday, rendered in the old calendar system my father used for his astronomical calculations. Gareth wouldn't know it. Mariette wouldn't care to learn it. They'll never open it by guessing. Tharion nodded slowly, and Vaylin could practically see him reorganizing his understanding of the situation, adjusting his strategy the way a master chess player recalculated after an unexpected move. When he looked at her again, there was something new in his expression. Not quite respect. He'd already given her that much. This was closer to recognition, the acknowledgement of an equal. This complicates things, he said. I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner, but I didn't know if I could trust. Don't apologize. You played it smart. He leaned against his desk, arms crossed. But now we need to decide what happens next, because Lord Wraith isn't going to simply give up, and your cousins have too much to lose to let you resurface without a fight. What do you suggest? Honestly, I suggest you stay dead a while longer. At her sharp look, he raised a hand. Listen, right now, they think they've won. They'll focus on finding the seal, on securing their position. That gives us time to gather evidence, to build a case against them that's strong enough to take to the king's justice. And in the meantime, they have control of my brother. Your brother is valuable to them alive and compliant. They won't hurt him as long as he's useful. Tharion's voice gentled slightly. I know it's not easy to hear, but he's safer with them believing you're dead than he would be if they knew you were alive and preparing to challenge them. Valine wanted to argue, wanted to demand they ride for Morroway, keep immediately, and tear her brother from their grasping hands. But the cold logic of Tharion's words settled over her like winter frost. He was right. Gods help her. The Iron Duke was right. So I'm a ghost, she said. What does a ghost do while she waits? Tharion smiled then. A real smile, sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. A ghost learns to fight back. The training yard at dawn was a place of ritual and pain. Valine arrived, shivering in the pre-dawn grey, wrapped in a cloak borrowed from the quartermaster, and already regretting her agreement to this madness. Around her, Tharion's guards were running drills, formations and footwork, the clash of practice swords creating a rhythm like a violent heartbeat. They moved with the easy confidence of men who'd been wielding weapons since childhood. She had been wielding embroidery needles. You're late. Tharion emerged from the armory carrying 2 wooden practice swords. He'd stripped down to shirt and trousers despite the cold, and Valine tried not to stare at the way the linen clung to shoulders that looked carved from the same stone as his fortress. The sun isn't even up yet. Enemies don't wait for convenient hours. He tossed her one of the practice swords. She caught it awkwardly, nearly dropping it when she felt the weight. First lesson. A sword is heavier than you think and lighter than you fear. Get used to the balance. Valine hefted the wooden blade, trying to find some natural way to hold it. Everything felt wrong. The grip too thick for her hands, the weight distributed in ways that made no sense. She'd watched her brother's fencing lessons years ago, had seen the elegant forms and precise footwork. This felt nothing like that graceful dance. I look ridiculous, don't I? You look like someone who's never held a weapon before. Tharion circled her slowly, assessing, which is what you are. But that can change. Show me your stance. She tried to remember what she'd seen, planting her feet and raising the sword in what she hoped was a defensive position. Tharion made a sound somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. You're preparing to serve tea, not fight for your life. Feet wider, knees bent. You want to be able to move in any direction without thinking, he demonstrated, his body shifting into a stance that looked both relaxed and coiled at once, like a wolf at rest. Like this, Valine adjusted her position, immediately feeling the strain in muscles she didn't know she had. How long do I need to? Tharion's practice sword moved in a blur. She barely registered the strike before her own weapon was knocked aside, and the wooden blade stopped a hair's breadth from her throat. You're dead, he said flatly. Again, they reset. Valine tried to stay ready this time, watching for the telltale shift of his weight. It didn't help. He came from a different angle, and suddenly she was stumbling backward with his sword hovering near her ribs. Dead. Reset. Strike. Dead. Reset. Strike. Dead. By the time the sun finally crept over the eastern peaks, Valine had died a dozen times and was sweating despite the cold. Her arms burned, her legs trembled, and she was fairly certain she'd never be able to lift anything heavier than a spoon again. I'm terrible at this, she gasped, leaning on her practice sword like a cane. You're untrained. There's a difference. Tharion lowered his weapon, not even breathing hard. But you're also thinking too much. You're trying to plan 3 moves ahead like you're playing chess. Combat doesn't work that way. Then how does it work? Instinct. Response. You see an opening. You take it. You sense danger. You move. He stepped closer, adjusting her grip on the sword. His hands were warm against her cold fingers, calloused and sure. Your mind is your greatest weapon, Lady Valine, but sometimes you need to let your body think for itself. Trust it. My body wants to run away and hide. Good, that's honest. Something that might have been approval flickered across his scarred face. Fear keeps you alive if you learn to use it. Now again. This time, don't try to predict what I'll do. Just react. They fell into the rhythm again. Strike, parry, reset. Slowly, painfully, Valine began to feel the difference between thinking and doing. Her body started to remember the movements, muscle-finding patterns her mind couldn't articulate. She was still hopelessly outmatched, still died more often than not, but occasionally, just occasionally, her sword was in the right place at the right time. "Better," Tharion said after she managed to deflect one of his strikes. Again, they continued, as the morning brightened and the training yard filled with other soldiers. Valine was dimly aware of curious glances, whispered speculation about why the Duke was personally training the mysterious woman from the tower. She ignored them, focused entirely on the deadly dance of advance and retreat. Then Tharion changed tactics. Instead of the controlled strikes he'd been using, he came at her with a quick combination: high, low, high, again. Valine's practice sword caught the first blow, but the force of it shocked through her tired arms. The second strike she dodged by pure instinct, stumbling sideways. The third caught her completely off guard. She tried to backstep, but her foot landed on a patch of ice, hidden under trampled snow. Her legs went out from under her, and suddenly she was falling backward, arms pinwheeling uselessly. Tharion moved faster than should have been possible for a man his size. His arm caught her around the waist, arresting her fall and pulling her against his chest. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen, her back pressed to his front, his breath warm against her ear. "Careful," he said, and his voice was rough with something that wasn't quite concern and wasn't quite anything she could name. Valine should have stepped away, should have thanked him politely and put proper distance between them. Instead, she found herself noticing details she had no business noticing. The solid strength of the arm still wrapped around her waist, the way his heart beat steady and sure against her shoulder blade, the scent of steel and winter air that clung to him. "I'm always careful," she managed. "It's keeping my feet under me that's the problem." She felt rather than heard his low laugh, a rumble that vibrated through his chest into her spine. Then, slowly, he released her and stepped back. When she turned to face him, something had shifted in his expression. The iron mask had slipped, just for a moment, and she caught a glimpse of confusion beneath it, as though he'd surprised himself as much as her. "That's enough for today," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "You did well. Better than I expected for a first session. I died 17 times. You also landed 3 successful parries and dodged 4 strikes that should have killed you. That's progress." He retrieved both practice swords, not quite meeting her eyes. "We'll continue tomorrow. Same time." "Same time," Valine echoed, watching as he walked toward the armory with just slightly less than his usual commanding stride. She stood in the training yard, her body aching and her mind spinning, trying to understand what had just passed between them in that brief moment of contact. Around her, the morning drills continued, soldiers calling orders, steel ringing against steel, the everyday violence of keeping a fortress ready for war. But for the first time since arriving at Ironholt, Valine felt like she might belong here, not as a rescued victim or an honored guest, but as someone learning to stand her ground, someone learning to fight back. The evening meal in Ironholt's great hall was usually a subdued affair, efficient and austere like everything else the Duke commanded. Tonight, however, felt different. The air carried a tension that Valine couldn't name, a thickness that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She'd grown to trust those instincts over the past 3 weeks. The same survival sense that had kept her alive in her cousin's house now whispered warnings she'd learned not to ignore. Tharion sat at the high table, reviewing reports while he ate, a habit that drove Mistress Carrag to distraction, but one he refused to break. To his right sat Seward, his seneschal, a thin man with clever eyes and soft hands who'd served the Bellgrave family for 20 years. On Tharion's left, the seat reserved for honored guests, Valine picked at her meal and watched the room. Something was wrong. The servants moved with unusual haste, eyes downcast more than usual. The guards posted at the doors seemed tenser, hands closer to their weapons. And Seward, normally quick with advice and commentary, had barely spoken all evening, his attention fixed on the Duke with an intensity that felt less like attentiveness and more like waiting. Waiting for what? A serving girl approached the high table with a pitcher of wine, her hands trembling slightly as she refilled the goblets. Valine watched her pour Tharion's cup, noticed the way the girl's eyes darted to Seward before she moved on. It was quick, barely a glance, but it was there. Recognition passed between them. Valine's blood went cold. She'd seen that look before, in her aunt's house, servants and conspirators confirming their roles in whatever plot was unfolding. Her mind raced through possibilities, discarding and calculating with the speed Tharion had tried to teach her to fight with. Tharion reached for his wine cup. "Wait," Valine said, louder than she'd intended. Conversation died around the high table. Tharion's hand paused halfway to the goblet, and he turned to her with a raised eyebrow. "Is something wrong?" Everything was wrong, but she had no proof, nothing but instinct and a serving girl's nervous glance. If she was mistaken, she'd embarrass herself and possibly insult the Duke's long-serving seneschal. If she was right and stayed silent, Tharion would drink poison. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "Don't drink that." She stood, her chair scraping against stone. "Please, something's wrong with it." Seward's face flushed with indignation. "My lady, that's a serious accusation. The wine comes from the Duke's private stores, poured by trusted servants. Then you won't mind if someone else tests it first." Valine kept her eyes on Tharion, willing him to see the certainty in her expression. "Your Grace, I know how this sounds, but I'm asking you to trust me." The hall had gone absolutely silent. Every eye was on the high table, watching the Duke weigh the word of a woman he'd known for less than a month against a seneschal who'd served his family for 2 decades. Tharion's pale eyes studied her face, reading something there that made him nod slowly. "Very well." He pushed the goblet toward Seward. "You heard the lady. Someone should test it." "My lord, this is absurd." "Then it should be easy to prove Lady Valine wrong." Tharion's voice carried the edge of command that had held the North against impossible odds. "Drink." Seward's face went from red to ashen in a heartbeat. There's no need to. I insist." Tharion rose from his seat, one hand dropping casually to the sword at his belt. Around the hall, his guards shifted position, suddenly alert. "Unless you have some reason to refuse?" The seneschal's eyes darted around the room, looking for escape routes, allies, anything. They landed on the serving girl who'd poured the wine. She was already backing toward the kitchen entrance, her nerve breaking. "Stop her," Tharion commanded, and 2 guards moved to block the girl's retreat. She froze, trapped, and something in her expression confirmed every horrible suspicion. Seward lunged, not for the door or for a weapon, but for the wine goblet itself. His hands closed around it, and for a wild moment Valine thought he meant to drink it, to prove his innocence even at the cost of his life. Then she saw the madness in his eyes and understood. He was trying to destroy the evidence, to dash the cup to the floor where the poison would be lost among the rushes and spilled wine. Tharion was faster. His hand caught Seward's wrist in a grip that made the older man cry out and drop the goblet. It hit the table and tipped, dark wine spreading across the wood like blood. But enough remained in the cup for what came next. "Bring me a rat from the kitchens," Tharion said, his voice deadly calm. "Now." A guard hurried off and returned moments later with a cage containing one of the fat rodents that plagued every castle's grain stores. Tharion dipped a crust of bread in the spilled wine and pushed it through the bars. The rat, hungry and opportunistic, devoured it eagerly. They didn't have to wait long. Within moments, the creature began to convulse. Its movements became erratic, jerking and spasming, foam gathering at its mouth. Then it went still, dead eyes, staring at nothing. The silence in the great hall was absolute. Tharion's hand was still locked around Seward's wrist, but his gaze found Valine across the table. In his eyes, she saw shock, gratitude, and something darker, the cold fury of a man who'd just discovered betrayal in his own house. "How long?" he asked Seward, his voice like winter wind through bare branches. "How long have you been selling me to my enemies?" The seneschal's composure crumbled completely. "You don't understand. Lord Wraith," he offered, "my family's debts." "Wraith," Tharion's jaw clenched. "Of course, the same bastard trying to steal the Serpent's Run." His eyes cut to Vailene again, pieces clicking into place. He knew she was here. You told him. He would have found out eventually. And he promised that if I helped, when he took control of the northern trade routes, my family would. Your family will be stripped of their lands and titles for treason. Tharion released Seward's wrist and stepped back, as though continuing to touch the man might contaminate him. Guards, take him to the cells, and someone find out what else he sold to Wraith. Documents, patrol routes, supply schedules, all of it. The guards moved forward, but Seward wasn't finished. He turned to Vailene with hate twisting his features into something ugly. You, he spat. You were supposed to be dead, frozen in the Blackwood where you belonged, but you had to survive, had to come here and ruin everything. Enough! Tharion's voice cracked like a whip. Get him out of my sight. They dragged Seward away, his protests echoing until a door slammed shut and silenced them. The serving girl went with him, weeping and babbling about needing money for her sick mother. Tharion stood at the high table, staring at the poisoned wine, his expression carved from granite. Slowly, the hall began to breathe again. Quiet conversations started up, uncertain and shocked. Servants hurried to clear the high table, removing every dish and cup that might have been contaminated. Through it all, Tharion didn't move, didn't speak. Vailene approached him carefully, as one might approach a wounded animal. Your Grace, you saved my life. He turned to face her, and the iron mask was completely gone now. What remained was raw and real, a man confronting his own mortality and the bitter knowledge that someone he'd trusted had tried to end it. How did you know? I didn't. Not for certain. She thought of her father's lessons, the years spent learning to read the subtle signs of danger in seemingly safe places. But I've lived with vipers long enough to recognize their movements. The girl's glance at Seward, his unusual silence, the way he watched you reach for the cup. It all felt wrong. Your instincts are better than mine, apparently. I've worked beside that man for 5 years and never suspected. His hand came up, almost touching her face before he seemed to remember himself, and dropped it. I owe you a debt I can never repay. You already repaid it. You pulled me from the snow when you could have left me to die. Vailene held his gaze, wanting him to understand. We're even, Your Grace. Or better yet, we're allies. And allies protect each other. Something shifted in Tharion's expression, a wall coming down, a door opening that had been locked for years. When he spoke again, his voice was soft enough that only she could hear. Tharion, when we're alone, call me Tharion. I think we're past titles now, don't you? And standing in the great hall, surrounded by the aftermath of assassination and betrayal, Vailene realized that somewhere along the way, between practiced swords and poisoned wine, between rescue and trust, she'd stopped seeing the Iron Duke and started seeing just the man. A dangerous realization, perhaps the most dangerous one yet. The riders arrived 3 days after Seward's arrest, their banners visible from the watchtower long before they reached Ironholt's gates. Vailene stood at the window of Tharion's study, watching the procession wind up the mountain road. Even from this distance, she recognized the red and gold of House Morroway. The colors she'd once worn with pride now turned to instruments of threat. Her hands gripped the windowsill hard enough to hurt. How many? Tharion asked from behind her, his tone carefully neutral. 20 mounted soldiers, 2 carriages. She forced herself to analyze rather than panic, to think like the strategist he'd been teaching her to become. Gareth will be in the lead carriage. He always preferred to make an entrance. The second will carry Mariette and probably a magistrate. They'll want the appearance of legal authority. Smart. Tharion moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him in the cold room. They're not coming for a fight. They're coming for a performance. What do we do? We? He glanced at her, and something fierce flashed in his pale eyes. You don't have to face them, Vailene. I can send you to the southern tower, keep you out of sight. Let me handle this. The offer was tempting. Every instinct screamed at her to hide, to avoid the confrontation that had been building since the moment Tharion had cut open that burlap sack. But hiding wouldn't make this go away. Her cousins had come for her, and they wouldn't leave without answers, or without forcing Tharion into an impossible position. No. She straightened her spine, calling on every lesson in deportment she'd ever learned. I won't cower while you fight my battles. Besides, you said it yourself. This is a performance, and I know these actors better than anyone. Tharion studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Then, we perform together. But we do it on my terms, in my hall, by my rules. Agreed? Agreed. They descended to the great hall, where Tharion's household was already assembling. Word had spread quickly. The Duke's guards lined the walls, hands resting on sword hilts, while servants whispered in corners about the Morroway banners flying at the gate. Mistress Carrag appeared at Vaelin's side, pressing a cup of something warm into her shaking hands. "Steady now," the healer murmured. "You've survived worse than a few grasping relatives." Had she? Vaelin wasn't certain anymore. At least in the burlap sack, she'd only had herself to worry about. Now Tharion was risking his political standing, possibly even his relationship with other noble houses, by sheltering her. The weight of that responsibility pressed down like a physical thing. The great doors opened, and her cousins swept in with all the arrogance of people who believed themselves untouchable. Gareth came first, dressed in fine velvets that probably cost more than most families earned in a year. He'd always been handsome in a cold, reptilian way, sharp features and calculating eyes that missed nothing of value. Behind him, Mariette glided with practiced grace, her smile warm and false as summer snow. And between them, looking uncomfortable in his magistrate's robes, was old Edric Finn, who'd adjudicated disputes in Thornhaven for 30 years and been in the Morroway pocket for at least 10 of them. Their eyes swept the hall, clearly expecting to find a minor border fortress staffed by rough soldiers. What they found instead was the full assembly of Ironholt's household, an impressive display of military strength and disciplined order that made Gareth's 20 guards look like a merchant's escort. And at the center, seated in the high seat with a sword across his knees, was the Iron Duke himself. Tharion didn't rise, didn't acknowledge their entrance with anything more than a raised eyebrow. The insult was deliberate and devastating. They were petitioners in his hall, not equals worthy of formal greeting. Gareth's jaw tightened, but he managed a bow. "Your Grace, we thank you for receiving us on such short notice. I don't recall inviting you." Tharion's voice carried through the hall, flat and uncompromising. "State your business." "We've come regarding a family matter, a delicate situation involving—" Gareth's eyes found Vaelin standing beside Tharion's seat, and his face went through a remarkable transformation. Shock, fury, fear, all flickering past before settling on a mask of concern. "Vaelin, thank the gods, you're alive. We've been searching everywhere. Feared the worst when you disappeared." "Don't." The single word from Tharion cut through Gareth's performance like a blade through silk. "Don't insult my intelligence or waste my time with pretty lies. I know exactly what happened to Lady Vaeline. The question is what you're going to do about it now." Mariette stepped forward, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Your Grace, I fear there's been some terrible misunderstanding. Our dear cousin suffered a tragic accident. She suffered an attempted murder." Tharion rose from his seat, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She was bound, gagged, and left to freeze in the Blackwood. I found her myself, half dead from exposure. "So let's dispense with the fiction, shall we?" Magistrate Finn cleared his throat nervously. "Your Grace, these are serious accusations, without evidence. I have all the evidence I need. I have the victim, alive and willing to testify. I have the location where she was abandoned, and I have a seneschal who, before his arrest for attempting to poison me, was remarkably forthcoming about certain business arrangements involving Lord Severin Wraith and the Morroway seal." The color drained from Gareth's face. Beside him, Mariette's smile finally cracked. "This is absurd," Gareth said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "You have no authority to hold her. Lady Vaeline is under our legal guardianship until she comes of age." "She came of age 3 months ago." Tharion's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "Which makes your guardianship null and void. She's a free woman, under the law, and currently a guest in my household under my protection." "A guest?" Mariette's voice turned sharp. "Or a prisoner you're using for political leverage? Ask her yourself." All eyes turned to Vaelin. This was the moment she'd been dreading, when the performance became personal, when she had to face the people who'd tried to kill her and choose which side of the divide to stand on. She thought of the burlap sack, the cold, the certainty that she would die alone and forgotten. Then she thought of Tharion catching her when she fell, teaching her to fight, trusting her instincts about poisoned wine. The choice wasn't difficult at all. "I'm here of my own free will," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Duke Bellgrave saved my life when you tried to end it. He's offered me sanctuary, and I've accepted, gladly." "You don't know what you're saying," Gareth hissed, taking a step toward her. "You're confused, traumatized." Tharion's hand dropped to his sword. The sound of steel sliding from the scabbard echoed through the hall. "Take another step toward her," he said softly, "and it will be your last." The guards along the walls shifted, suddenly alert. Gareth froze, finally seeming to realize how badly he'd miscalculated. This wasn't some minor border lord who could be bullied or bribed. This was the man who held the North through sheer force of will and wouldn't hesitate to spill noble blood on his own floor. Magistrate Finn tried diplomacy. "Your Grace, surely we can reach some accommodation. Lady Vaylin has responsibilities to her family, obligations. Her only obligation is to herself." Tharion sheathed his sword with deliberate care. "And she's decided to stay. Now you have a choice. You can accept that and leave peacefully. Or you can challenge my authority in my own fortress, in which case I'll be forced to defend it. And I promise you, that's not a conflict you want." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Vaylin watched her cousins calculate odds, weigh risks, search for any angle that might still work in their favor. She saw the moment they realized they had none. "This isn't over," Gareth said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "We'll take this to the King's justice. We'll expose your manipulation of a vulnerable woman. Do that." Tharion's smile was all teeth. "And I'll counter with charges of attempted murder, conspiracy, and fraud. I wonder whose case the King will find more compelling." Mariette grabbed Gareth's arm before he could respond, her fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks. "We'll take our leave, Your Grace. But mark my words, you're making a powerful enemy in Lord Wraith. I've had worse." They swept out with as much dignity as they could salvage, Magistrate trailing behind like a whipped dog. The great doors slammed shut, and for a long moment, no one in the hall moved or breathed. Then Vaylin's legs gave out. Tharion caught her before she hit the floor, strong arms wrapping around her waist. "I've got you," he murmured against her hair. "You did perfectly. It's over." But it wasn't over, and they both knew it. This was just the beginning. They came back within a fortnight, but not alone. Vaylin was in the training yard when the watchman's horn sounded. 3 sharp blasts that meant official business at the gates. She paused mid-strike, practice sword still raised, and met Tharion's eyes across the packed earth. They'd both known this was coming. Gareth and Mariette weren't the type to accept defeat quietly. "How many this time?" she asked, lowering her weapon. Tharion listened to the pattern of horn calls, his expression grim. "Enough to make a statement. Get cleaned up and meet me in the Great Hall." "And Vaylin?" He caught her arm as she turned to go. "Whatever happens, stay close to me. Understand?" She nodded, pulse already racing. This was it, the real confrontation, the one that would decide everything. An hour later, she stood beside Tharion's high seat, dressed in the finest gown Ironholt seamstresses could produce on short notice. Deep blue wool trimmed with silver thread, the colors of her mother's house, rather than the Morroway red and gold. A deliberate choice. She wasn't their creature anymore. The doors opened, and her cousins entered with an entourage that made their first visit look modest. 20 more guards, 3 magistrates, including one wearing the King's seal, and, Vaylin's heart sank, Lord Severin Wraith himself. Wraith was everything the rumors promised, tall and distinguished, with silver threading through dark hair and the kind of smile that probably charmed half the noble houses in the realm. He carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd never faced a problem he couldn't buy, seduce, or intimidate his way through. "Duke Bellgrave," Wraith's voice was smooth as aged wine, "thank you for receiving us. I apologize for the size of our party, but given the serious nature of these accusations, we felt it prudent to ensure proper legal representation." "Lord Wraith," Tharion didn't rise from his seat, "I wasn't aware you had any legal standing in this matter. I'm here as a concerned party, with business interests affected by these proceedings. Surely you don't object to witnesses? That depends on what they're witnessing." The magistrate with the King's seal stepped forward, a severe woman named Ashcroft, who had a reputation for incorruptibility. At least Gareth hadn't managed to buy everyone. Your Grace, we've received formal complaints from House Morroway regarding your detention of Lady Vaylin Morroway. They assert that you're holding her against her will and using undue influence to turn her against her legal guardians. They're not my guardians, Vaylin said clearly. I'm of age, which makes me legally independent, and I'm here by choice. Gareth stepped forward, his face arranged in sorrowful concern. Cousin, please, we know what the Duke has told you, but you must see how this looks. You disappear, turn up in his fortress, and suddenly you're making wild accusations against your own family. It's clear you've been manipulated. The only manipulation was yours. Vaylin descended from the dais, and she felt rather than saw Tharion tense behind her, ready to intervene if needed. But this was her battle to fight. You tried to force me to sign over the Morroway seal. When I refused, you had me bound and left to die in the Blackwood. These are fantasies, Mariette said smoothly. Trauma-induced delusions from a girl who clearly suffered some accident in the woods. No accident. Murder. Vaylin pulled a folded document from her sleeve, one of many she and Tharion had prepared over the past weeks. This is a sworn statement from a hunter who saw 3 riders matching your guard's descriptions disposing of a large sack in the Blackwood on the night I disappeared. He didn't come forward earlier because he feared retribution. He's willing to testify now. Magistrate Ashcroft accepted the document, reading it with careful attention. Gareth's composure cracked slightly. One statement from a hunter of dubious character proves nothing. Then perhaps this will interest you more. Vaylin produced another document. Financial records showing substantial payments from Lord Wraith to House Morroway, beginning 6 months ago, and increasing dramatically after my father's death. Curious timing, don't you think? Wraith's smile never wavered. I've had legitimate business dealings with House Morroway. There's nothing illegal about commerce. Commerce? No. Conspiracy to commit murder in exchange for illegal passage rights through the Serpent's Run? That's considerably less legal. Tharion rose from his seat, pulling out a leather folder that Vaylin recognized from his study. These are copies of correspondence between you and the late Seneschal Seward. Very illuminating reading, especially the parts about eliminating obstacles to securing the mountain pass. The color drained from Wraith's face. Those are private documents, illegally obtained. They're evidence of treason, obtained from a confessed traitor. Tharion descended from the dais, and the hall seemed to shrink around his presence. Seward was remarkably forthcoming once he realized the poisoning attempt had failed. He detailed your entire scheme, how you approached House Morroway with an offer to split profits from the Serpent's Run if they could secure the seal, how you suggested dealing with Lady Vaylin permanently when she refused to cooperate. Magistrate Ashcroft's expression had gone from skeptical to shocked. These are capital charges. They are. Tharion handed her the folder, which is why I'm bringing them before you officially. Lord Wraith, Gareth Morroway, and Mariette Morroway stand accused of conspiracy to commit murder, attempted theft of noble lands, and treason against the interests of the Crown. This is absurd, Gareth exploded. You can't possibly expect anyone to believe the word of a disgraced seneschal over yours. Vaylin stepped closer to her cousin, and she felt the fear that had haunted her since her father's death finally transform into something harder. Anger. Righteous, burning anger. The same man who dismissed all of father's advisors within a week of his death, who isolated me from anyone who might have helped, who forged documents claiming temporary guardianship when the will clearly stated I was to inherit independently. You have no proof of forgery. Actually, I do. Vaylin produced her final piece of evidence, a letter in her father's hand, written months before his death. Father suspected something was wrong. He wrote to the Archivist Guild, requesting they keep sealed copies of all his important documents, including his will. This is their certification that the will you probated was altered. The original clearly states that I inherit the seal and pass rights independently at age 20, with no guardianship provisions whatsoever. The silence in the Great Hall was absolute. Magistrate Ashcroft took the letter, compared it against the documents Gareth had submitted weeks ago, and her lips pressed into a thin line. These signatures don't match, nor do several key clauses. It's a mistake, clerical error, Mariette tried, but her voice lacked conviction. It's fraud. Ashcroft's voice rang with authority. And combined with the financial evidence, the witness statement, and the testimony from the seneschal, it forms a compelling case for conspiracy. She turned to her fellow magistrates. I call for immediate arrest pending formal trial before the king's justice. Wraith moved first, his hand dropping to his sword. I won't be taken by some jumped-up mountain duke and his pet magistrates. Steel sang as Tharion drew his blade. Around the hall, guards moved to block the exits, their weapons gleaming in the torchlight. You'll be taken, Tharion said softly, or you'll die here. Your choice, Lord Wraith. But either way, you're not leaving Ironholt a free man. For a moment, Valine thought Wraith might actually fight. His hand tightened on his sword hilt, eyes calculating odds and finding them wanting. Tharion stood between him and freedom, and the Iron Duke's reputation wasn't built on mercy or hesitation. This isn't over, Wraith said, releasing his sword and raising his hands in surrender. I have allies, powerful friends who won't stand for this treatment. Then they can take it up with the king. Tharion gestured, and guards moved forward to disarm Wraith and the Morroways. Until then, you'll enjoy the hospitality of my dungeons. Gareth lunged toward Vailina, desperation overriding sense. You stupid girl, do you have any idea what you've done? The seal is useless. Without... Tharion's fist caught him in the jaw, a clean strike that sent Gareth sprawling. Touch her again, the Duke said conversationally, and I'll forget I'm supposed to deliver you to trial intact. They dragged her cousins away, still protesting, still making threats that rang hollow in the stone hall. Wraith went quietly, but his eyes promised retribution as guards led him toward the dungeons. When the doors finally closed, Valine found herself trembling, not with fear this time, but with the aftermath of adrenaline and triumph, and the sheer relief of finally being believed. You did it, Tharion said, and there was something like awe in his voice. You took them apart piece by piece with nothing but evidence and courage. We did it, she corrected. I couldn't have. He pulled her into his arms, cutting off her words with the fierce embrace of someone who just watched her face down demons and win. Valine melted into him, letting herself feel safe for the first time in months. It's really over, she whispered against his chest. Almost. Tharion pulled back enough to look at her, and his expression was serious. The trial will take months, and even then, there's the matter of recovering the seal, securing Morroway Keep, protecting your brother. I know. She did know. This was victory, but not the end. One battle at a time. One battle at a time, he agreed. And then softer, together. Spring came late to the northern mountains, but when it finally arrived, it transformed Ironholt from a fortress of ice and stone into something almost beautiful. Wildflowers pushed through the last patches of snow in the courtyards, and the wind that howled down from the peaks carried the scent of pine and thawing earth instead of just bitter cold. Valine stood in her tower room, no longer the guest chambers but a permanent suite Tharion had insisted she take, packing the few belongings she'd accumulated over the past 3 months. The blue wool dress she'd worn to face down her cousins, the practice sword Tharion had given her after she'd finally managed to land a strike on him during training, books borrowed from his library that she'd meant to return but kept forgetting, a life, small but real, that she was preparing to leave behind. The trial had concluded a week ago in the capital. Gareth, Mariette, and Lord Wraith had all been found guilty. Conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder, the list of crimes long enough to ensure they'd spend the rest of their lives in various degrees of imprisonment and disgrace. The Morroway seal had been recovered from her father's safe exactly where she'd said it would be, the combination working perfectly despite her cousin's months of searching. Her brother Thomas had been released from their clutches and was currently staying with their mother's sister in the south, somewhere safe and far from political intrigue. Everything had worked out exactly as it should. Valine had her name back, her inheritance, her freedom. The magistrates had formally restored her to full control of Morroway lands and the strategic mountain pass that came with them. She should have been celebrating. Instead, she was folding clothes with hands that shook slightly and trying not to think about what leaving Ironholt actually meant. You're really going through with this? Valine turned to find Mistress Carrag in the doorway, arms crossed, and wearing the expression she usually reserved for patients who insisted they were well enough to leave the infirmary when they clearly weren't. The estate won't manage itself. Thomas needs to see his ancestral home, learn what it means to be a Morroway. And someone needs to ensure Gareth didn't completely bankrupt us during his brief tenure. Vaylin managed a smile that felt only slightly forced. It's time. Time to run away, you mean? The words hit harder than they should have. I'm not running. I'm going home. Ironholt is your home. Carag entered the room and began refolding the clothes Vaylin had just packed, doing it properly instead of the haphazard job she'd been making of it. You know it. I know it. Every person in this fortress knows it. The only one who seems confused on the matter is you. I've imposed on the Duke's hospitality long enough. The Duke? Carag's laugh was sharp. Is that what we're calling him now? Strange. I could have sworn I heard you call him Tharion just yesterday. Multiple times, in fact, usually while he was teaching you that new disarming technique in the training yard. Heat crept up Vaylin's neck. That's different. We were training. You were dancing around each other like two people too stubborn to admit what's perfectly obvious to everyone else. The healer's expression softened. Child, I've served House Bellgrave for 20 years. I watched Tharion build those iron walls around his heart after Helena died, watched him turn himself into something hard and cold because it hurt less than staying human. And then you stumbled into his life half frozen and wholly defiant, and for the first time in a decade, I've seen him smile. Really smile. Not that grim thing he does when he's being the Duke. He's been kind to me. I'm grateful. If you finish that sentence with, "But gratitude isn't love," I'm going to prescribe you something for acute stupidity. Kara gripped Vaylin's shoulders, forcing her to meet her eyes. What are you so afraid of? Everything. Nothing. The way her heart had started racing whenever Tharion entered a room, the fact that she'd stopped dreaming about the cold and started dreaming about pale grey eyes and scarred smiles, the terrifying realization that somewhere between being rescued and becoming allies and friends and something more, she'd fallen completely, irrevocably, in love with the Iron Duke. And love, in her experience, was just another word for vulnerability. Another way to get hurt. I don't know how to do this, Vaylin whispered. My whole life, I was taught that my value came from what I could offer politically, a good marriage, useful connections, strategic alliances. And now I'm free to choose, except I don't know how to choose for myself. What if I'm just confusing gratitude for something else? What if I stay and realize I made a mistake, and then I've trapped both of us in something neither of us actually wanted? And what if you leave and spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been? Carag squeezed her shoulders gently. That's the risk of being alive and human, dear girl. Sometimes you have to trust your heart even when your head is screaming caution. Before Vaylin could respond, a commotion erupted in the courtyard below, children's laughter and the sound of someone trying to maintain order over chaos. She moved to the window and looked down to see Tharion surrounded by the fortress orphans, all clamoring for his attention at once. He'd been teaching them swordplay, she realized. All of them had wooden practice weapons, and little Mera was demonstrating a stance that looked remarkably similar to the one Vaylin herself had learned. Tharion was praising her form, completely unaware that he had dirt on his cheek and his hair was standing up from where one of the boys had clearly been using him as a climbing post. The Iron Duke, terror of the North, reduced to gentle chaos by a dozen orphans who adored him. Vaylina's heart cracked open completely. He'll make a wonderful father someday, Carag said quietly from behind her, if he ever lets himself want that future. The implication hung in the air like morning mist. Vaylin watched Tharion scoop up the smallest child, a girl of maybe 4 who'd been tugging insistently at his sleeve, and listened to him explain something about balance and footwork with infinite patience. I need to talk to him, she said, finally showing some sense. Kara shooed her toward the door. Go, before you think yourself out of it again. Vaylin descended the tower stairs with her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd faced down her murderous cousins, exposed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of nobility, survived being left to die in the frozen woods. Surely she could manage one honest conversation. Except this felt more terrifying than all of those combined. She found Tharion in the stables an hour later, after the children had been herded back to their lessons and he'd escaped to tend his warhorse. He was brushing the massive destrier with methodical strokes, his expression distant in the way it got when he was thinking too hard about something. You're good with them, Vaylin said from the stable entrance. The children, they love you. Tharion's hand paused mid-stroke. They're easy to love. They don't have agendas or ulterior motives. Just honest needs and honest affection. He resumed brushing. I heard you're leaving tomorrow. Word travels fast. It's a fortress. Everyone knows everything. He moved to the horse's other side, putting the animal between them. Morroway, Keep is a good estate. You'll do well there. Will I? You're smart, capable, and you've proven you can handle yourself in difficult situations. Your tenants will be lucky to have you. His voice was carefully neutral, the tone he used when discussing supply shipments or patrol rotations. I've arranged an escort for the journey. 20 men should be sufficient, but if you'd prefer more— Tharion, stop. He did, finally looking at her over the horse's back. His expression was locked down tight, every emotion buried behind iron walls. I don't want an escort, Vaylin said. I don't want to go back to Morroway Keep, at least not permanently, and I don't want to have this entire conversation with a horse between us. Something flickered in his eyes. Hope, maybe, or fear. What do you want? Come out here and I'll tell you. For a moment she thought he'd refuse, that he'd retreat behind the Duke persona and end this before it could begin. Then he set down the brush and circled the horse, stopping a few feet away from her, close enough to touch but not touching, waiting. Vaylin had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in her head, had planned elegant speeches about partnership and mutual respect and practical considerations. All of it evaporated the moment she met his eyes. I want to stay, she said simply. Not as a guest or someone under your protection. I want to stay because I choose to, because this feels more like home than anywhere I've ever been. Because— she took a breath. Because when I imagine my future, you're in it. And I don't know how to say that without sounding like I'm just grateful or confused or— Tharion kissed her. It wasn't tentative or questioning. It was fierce and sure, one hand cupping her face while the other wrapped around her waist, pulling her close. He kissed her like she was air and he'd been drowning, like she was the answer to a question he'd been afraid to ask. Vaylina melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, and kissed him back with all the pent-up longing of 3 months spent dancing around what they both wanted. He tasted like winter air and possibility, and when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she found herself laughing with pure relief. I was trying to make a point, she said against his mouth. You made it. Tharion rested his forehead against hers, and his voice was rough with emotion. I was going to let you go, thought it was the noble thing to do, give you freedom, let you make choices without my influence. But gods, Vaylin, I don't want to be noble. I want to be selfish. I want to ask you to stay and mean it. Want to wake up every morning knowing you're here. Want— he broke off, jaw clenching. Want what? Everything. The word came out raw and honest. I want everything with you. A future, a partnership, a life. I want to teach our children to read and fight and think for themselves. I want to grow old arguing with you about strategy and philosophy, and whether the Eastern Pass needs better fortification. I want all of it, and I know it's too much to ask, too soon, but I can't. Yes. Tharion blinked. Yes? Yes to all of it. Yes to staying, yes to a future, yes to everything. Vaylin pulled back enough to see his face clearly. I love you. I think I started falling the moment you heard me whisper, help me, and decided I was worth saving. And I kept falling every time you showed me kindness, disguised as practicality, every time you taught me to be strong instead of just surviving. You looked at me and saw someone worth believing in, and I want to spend the rest of my life being that person, with you. The smile that broke across Tharion's face was like sunrise after a long winter, warm and bright and utterly transforming. I should warn you, I'm terrible at romance. I'll probably forget important dates and get too focused on fortification plans, and I'll probably drive you crazy questioning your strategies and reorganizing your library and teaching all the orphans to read philosophy. She grinned. We'll be a disaster together. He kissed her again, softer this time. Marry me. That wasn't a question. It wasn't meant to be. I'm the Iron Duke. I don't ask. I command. But his eyes were dancing with humor and hope and love. Well, I'm Vaylin Morroway, and I don't take commands, she pretended to consider, but I might accept a properly worded proposal. You know, something with actual romance instead of just demands. Tharion dropped to one knee right there in the stable, still holding her hand, looking up at her with complete sincerity. "Vailene Morroway, you came into my life as a voice in the darkness, asking for help, and you've become the light that makes everything else make sense. You challenge me, inspire me, and make me want to be the man I was before I learned to hide behind iron. Will you marry me? Will you be my duchess, my partner, my equal in all things? Will you stay, not because you owe me or because you're grateful, but because you choose this life we could build together?" Vailene's eyes burned with tears. She didn't bother hiding. "Now that's a proper proposal. Yes. To all of it. Yes." He stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her once before setting her down and kissing her thoroughly enough that the stable hands would definitely be gossiping by dinner. Vailene didn't care. Let them gossip. Let everyone know that the girl they'd found half frozen in the Blackwood had chosen to stay, had chosen love, had chosen the Iron Duke, who'd proven to have the warmest heart in the north. "We should tell people," Tharion said eventually, still holding her close. "Make it official. There are customs, traditions." "Later." Vailene pulled him back down for another kiss. "Right now, I just want this. Just us." They stayed in the stable until the light began to fade, talking about everything and nothing, plans for the future, memories of the past, the thousand small details that needed to be worked out, but suddenly felt manageable because they'd faced them together. At some point, Tharion's warhorse got tired of being ignored and nudged his master's shoulder hard enough to make him stumble. "I think he's jealous," Vailene laughed. "He'll have to get used to sharing my attention." Tharion gave the horse an affectionate pat, then laced his fingers through Vailene's. "Come on. If we don't appear for dinner, Mistress Carrag will assume I've done something stupid and come looking for us." They walked back to the main keep hand in hand, and Vailene marveled at how natural it felt, how right. The fortress that had seemed so cold and forbidding when she'd first arrived now felt like exactly where she was meant to be. As they entered the great hall, conversation died. Every eye turned to their joined hands, and Vailene watched understanding ripple through the assembled household like wind through wheat. Tharion cleared his throat. "I have an announcement. Lady Vailene has agreed to become my wife and the Duchess of Ironholt." He looked down at her, and the love in his eyes was clear for everyone to see. "I hope you'll all join me in welcoming her not as a guest, but as family." The hall erupted in cheers. Mistress Carrag was crying openly. Several of the guards were grinning like fools, and the children who'd been helping in the kitchens came running to hug Vailene's legs and demand to know if this meant she'd be staying forever. "Forever," she confirmed, kneeling to their level. "I'm not going anywhere." That night, after the impromptu celebration had wound down and the fortress had settled into sleep, Vailene stood at her tower window one last time. But instead of looking out at the mountains with the anxiety of someone planning to leave, she looked with the eyes of someone coming home. Behind her, she heard Tharion's familiar footsteps. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Just thinking." She leaned back into his warmth. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night? When I asked why you saved me, I said you were safe, that no one touches what's under my protection. You also said I should remember that." Vailene turned in his arms, meeting his eyes. "I did. I remembered every word, every kindness you tried to disguise as duty. You became my shield when I had nothing, and somehow in the process, you became my home too." Tharion's hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "You saved me too, you know. I was so busy being iron that I'd forgotten how to be human. You reminded me. That tiny voice in the darkness asking for help, it saved us both." They stood together in the tower, the Iron Duke and the woman who'd melted his frozen heart, and looked out at the mountains that had witnessed their unlikely beginning. Somewhere in the darkness of the Blackwood, snow still covered the place where Vailene had nearly died. But that girl, terrified and abandoned and certain she was worthless, was gone. In her place stood a woman who'd learned to fight, to trust, to love without fear. A woman who'd chosen her own future and found it more beautiful than any destiny others had tried to impose. The voice that had whispered, "Help me," in desperate darkness, had found its answer in the most unexpected place. And that answer was home. "My beautiful family. If you made it all the way to the end, you're clearly my people. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. Thousands of you will watch this entire story, feel all the emotions, and then just scroll away without leaving a like or sharing it. Meanwhile, someone in your life, your friend, your mom, your book club, is desperately searching for a story exactly like this and has no idea it exists. It takes 2 seconds to share this video and make their day. And if you don't subscribe right now, YouTube will literally never show you my next story. Subscribe and never miss another epic romance. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royals Stories team.